Hello and welcome, everybody. We hope that you're having a good Wednesday afternoon.
It's Wednesday.
It is Wednesday, pre Christmas breaks, and I think one thing that I think is really important that we wanted to do and reflect on was start to open up and go, actually, what are we reading? What are we feeding ourselves? What are we kind of inspiring and different elements within that? And so before we jump into that, it would be great just to, if people don't mind, just to go around the room and just introduce. So hi, my name's Rob. I help run the Design Futures program at the RCA, and I'm the principal investigator on the Ecological Citizens Project. Algie.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Algie. I am a kind of person who researches and tries to make things that hopefully work in different contexts. Primarily at the moment, what I call it, well, I help small clients, small businesses and kind of freelance clients to think about what their brand means for them, how it helps them, how it helps people that they interact with, and then use that to hopefully make systems, objects that help them get to the futures that they might want.
Thanks. Andy.
Hi everyone. I'm actually signed into my work email, which I could tell in my job title, so I was already giving clues if anyone paid attention. So yeah, I work for a speculative design agency called Superflux. Kind of interested in sort of climate and just regenerative futures and that kind of work. I guess I'm part of the sort of collective with Rob and John and Lizzie, who's not here at the moment, who sort of hosts this thing, which is something we've been experimenting with this year to sort of see if there's the whole kind of, I guess a lot of the labels in this space can be a bit confusing. So we thought it would be useful to try to, and I recognize most of you here actually who probably joined at some point throughout the year. So good to see some familiar faces again. And I'll pass
Thanks,
over to
Andy.
Ian.
Right as I take a sip.
Perfect timing.
Yeah, so I don't really know what I do. I became a sort of teacher by accident. I teach a couple of courses, mostly in sort of interdisciplinary stuff around what I think is unpleasantly called deep tech. So basically scientific discoveries that people try and turn into things that make a difference in the world, mostly focused around zero carbon energy and health, more by accident than design. I'm trying to move away from just doing the teaching thing and trying to get more into working with clients and with teams, and try and ride those two horses. I don't know where it'll end up, but I'm trying.
Thanks, Ian. And Nathan.
Hi, I'm I'm currently in a kind of a bit of an in-betweeny place. I've been managing a farm for a few years and sort of took a farm through a sort of regenerative and organic conversion that was quite a that was through a bit of a perfect storm of a variety of different things during the pandemic, and learned a lot from that. I've relocated to Devon from Norfolk, where I was managing the farm, and I'm currently doing a master's in food systems and sustainability. And I've recently been learning at the Apricot Centre in regenerative land-based studies and have been sort of building my understanding of systems thinking, what regenerative means, particularly in sort of food and farming contexts, local food models. And so, yeah, that's me. Currently, basically a student doing a lot of thinking about stuff.
And John.
So I'm John. I run Smithery. We are a strategic design practice, and my interest in this was fired by working on future trends and signal system project that we built for the United Nations Development Programme, which just made me kind of like super aware of kind of like all of the different things that were going on in the world and all of the opportunities or indeed necessities for sort of like just intervening in the small places or larger places and do whatever I could, and then fell into the regenerative language thing just because I kept saying regenerative versus sustainable, and I went, that's interesting. How are these different? How do you move beyond one and through into another? Are they not in different directions, etc.?
Nice. Thanks, John. So today there was a sort of micro bit of homework, but not homework. And I think the thing is that we're trying to inspire is kind of quite often we have so many areas and subjects that we're looking at. Actually, who are the interesting people that we want to impart? What are those books? What are those texts? And I know, John, I think you might have set up a Miro, which is very kind of you. And I don't know if, that's the way that we'll do it.
Yeah.
I think so that it's not one person, then next person, then next person, then next person. If we all start by sharing one of our favorite books of things that are really interesting, with a link in the chat, and then we can pass it on and we can keep going. And then basically for as long as possible, we'll keep sharing. And I am more than happy to go first. So my book that I would recommend, that I find really interesting, not necessarily, and I'll just share screen for the moment, not just for the content, but actually for the way that it's written and the way that it's put together. So Ayana it's quite a perspective from the States. But what's really interesting, it's one of the first books that they've really got like raw prose of interviews, which I think is really interesting. And it assumes this, I think it's quite a utopian view that, right, how can everything work out? Where can it sit? What can it do? But my favorite thing about it is they've used a really simple detail in the spine. Basically, when you're flicking through it, they've got a few little pictograms that go, right, this is a heartfelt moment, this is an insight, but it's been really, really well considered, but it hasn't been so overly designed. And it's really interesting because it asks really good what if questions, and it really provokes really good what if questions. And I think that's quite often the challenge in this space, or my challenge in this space, is that quite often it's really easy for people to go, what we need to do is this, what we need to do is this. But actually sometimes asking these different questions and opening up new spaces is kind of part of it. And I think the hardest thing about some of this work is that we have, bless you, we have a voice, not the voice. So I think from my perspective, it's really important to raise these insights and these challenges, but then have it in such a means that other people can reappropriate from it. So you're not dictating, you're providing a framework that people can build on. And that does it. And it's really interesting. I would rate it. I think also there's been a really interesting process to how they put it together, in a quite accessible way, that points to lots more different resources. I also think it is a perspective that is heavily based in the States, but I think it's really important to borrow from as many things as possible. So yeah, I would just say check it out. It's pretty cool. What does it do wrong? I think it's kind of it bounds the sort of space between, it's not fully academic, but it's not totally lay reader audience. And sometimes it's good to be either, but yeah, it's cool. I think we should keep the pace. Algie, would you like to share something?
Yeah, so I mean, it was an interesting idea. Well, what I remember reading from the initial thing was what introduced you to regenerative thinking, perhaps, maybe what's got you thinking about it. And that got me thinking. So I was like, what did introduce me to all of this? And the first thing that came to mind is I studied regenerative medicine, which is kind of about thinking about upstream problems in medical care as opposed to downstream symptomatic treatments. And obviously it becomes a metaphor, or it becomes an organized science in a particular domain of what regenerative design is trying to do, but with like industrial scale engineering underneath it. So it's kind of interesting in that there's lots of analogies that are quite complicated. And I've always thought it would be quite cool to try and connect them and connect the metaphors in an effective way. Never have, but probably that was kind of thinking about how stem cell engineering and stuff works, how you can, like, there are principles about how you design using cells from particular people, and you take someone's cells, then you engineer them, and you're working with things that their immune system understands and stuff. Or there's taking other cells from other places and modifying them so that people's bodies can accept, other people's bodies can accept them, stuff like that. And I think there's a lot of interesting principles in, I mean, going and find a handbook of biopharmaceutical engineering. If that was kind of what got me into the thing. But in terms of what the next thing I realized was that I suck at reading. I get all these books and I read until I'm like, yeah, I kind of get the whole, I've got the gist, got the main concept of this thing. And then I'm like, well, fuck this. Why am I still reading this bloody thing? Which sounds a bit, well, it just makes me feel a bit Generation Z and kind of short attention span and uncommitted and useless.
Although there are a lot of books out there that are basically a blog post.
Wow.
300 page blog post. Yeah. Like, yeah, I think you've got to get it to 300 pages, haven't you? And then, then it's sort of a book officially. So you keep writing until you're at 300 pages.
Yeah. I don't think that is true though, of all the, like, anti-fragility. Taleb obviously is amazing, but yeah, I gave up on that after a while.
Algie, you're not alone, mate. I feel very seen. Totally relate. And I've been feeling guilty about it. I feel like this is a safe space.
Yeah. I mean, I do skim, and kind of one of the things that I love, which is very relevant, is Small is Beautiful, which I've tried to read on 3 separate occasions now, fully. But I have skimmed through it and got a sense of the kind of made sense in my own way of what, but that definitely speaks to me in terms of, well, there's constant, it's like the craftsperson mindset where you're gaining dignity through a process where the gains that you're receiving are kind of from like flow state experiences, or the connections you're making in those kind of micro moments with like an anticipatory goal kind of sense of what you're forming. And I think the way that he talks about how the industrial world, the mechanization of the industrial world, strips those faculties from people, and in terms of not just being able to, but learning that skill through the craft itself, by virtue of the kind of mass automation of things, which I think also speaks at the moment when we think about like AI and its like its autonomous agency, which then takes on our roles. It's like it can be less of an augmenting technology than a kind of substitutive technology. But yeah, anyway, very relevant today, even though there's a lot of explanation. I think part of the reason I found it so hard is there's so much explanation of things which seem now self-evident, but it was written in the 70s. So, but it's interesting as well to see that when that mindset was so non-obvious. But yeah, it feels like we are making progress by virtue of the fact that at least these things are somewhat self-explanatory, even if the systems aren't designed for them. But sorry, this is now kind of going on and on. But the thing that I think is most powerfully informative from the way I think about my practice is just Hugh Dubbley's writing generally. Almost everything, every article he's ever written has been like, oh boy, this is suddenly my yeah, it's very enlightening. But yeah, the biggest thing is that I thought was his article, which is called "Why We Should Stop Describing Design as Problem Solving." And what's so nice about it is it does a brief history of what the design field has been under the different kind of paradigm, whether it's the modernist paradigm or like paradigms with it that have kind of trailed through in terms of like cybernetics or systems thinking and stuff, and then coming up with kind of a reframing of design within a kind of designing for context, within thinking about designing systems that are regenerating within them continuously, design as conversation and stuff. He manages to abstract it in very tangible ways and provide kind of tools to frame what you're working on, and I really appreciate that. It might, like I think Citra, you know, the mission-oriented innovation handbook thing translated Dan Hill's kind of, oh, we want to strategic design into like, oh, well, these are the ways of designing strategically. And I feel like Hugh's on maybe a meta level of that, of the designing rather than the designing of the tools. But yeah, sorry, that's quite a
No, thank you, Archie. Ian, have you got any reflections?
So yeah, I mean, I have been now that Algae has made it safe for me to admit that I'm finding it difficult to finish a book. There's one that I'm working my way through, which I don't know if you guys are familiar with. It's quite old. It's called Networks of Power, and it is a book by a guy called Thomas P. Hughes, who's dead now, and it was written in about 1984. And it's one of those books that it sounds like it should be the most incredibly dry read. It's basically a history of the spread of electric power between 1880 and about 1930, starting with Edison in the US and going all the way through, looking at London and Berlin and the US and how it spread. And it's beautifully written. It's got some lovely kind of images of, you know, maps of how electricity supply, oh gosh, I've got this thingy going on, how electricity supply spread. And one of the things that's most amazing about it is, you know, it was written in 1984, I guess, 1983. And it is all about systems design. It's essentially one of the main things, the pain points that it makes is that Edison's success, and I know he's a controversial figure, but his success was ultimately because he designed a system from the beginning. That was his thing. Like they talk about him designing the light bulb, but really it was nothing to do with that. First of all, he didn't. But mostly the reason why he was successful is because he knew that he couldn't just design light bulbs. He had to design the generators. He had to design the network. He even had to design the kind of financial models that would make it work. And even, it starts talking about the impact of legislation in the UK and how that helped and hindered, and how other people who came later designed their technology in light of the legislation and the regulations that existed. And yeah, I mean, it's a beautiful read. I highly recommend it. It's quite hard to get hold of. I managed to borrow it from my university library, but I definitely want to get a copy of it for myself. Yeah, I think, well, there's a quote that I think is quite an interesting one, which is about the kind of the collaboration aspects and the way that no one invents anything is one of the points they kind of make. He's like, you can't pin an invention on anyone. It's always a sort of a dialogue and an interchange. And he talks about this other guy, Galois, who was the guy who invented one of the pioneers around alternating current, which, is how it ended up shaping up. And he says, Galois' fate was tragic. His experience also suggests that it is futile for an inventor, a historian of invention, or even the courts to attempt to prove who invented a machine, device or process, such as the steam engine, the telephone, or the transformer. James Watt, for instance, did not invent the steam engine. He invented a separately condensing steam engine. Alexander Graham Bell did not invent the telephone. He put together a telephone system that embodied a particular application of variable resistance. Edison did not invent the incandescent lamp. His achievement was an incandescent lamp with a high resistance filament. And it just goes on about that. He talks about how, kind of all design is systemic in a way, which I think is a nice observation. And I mean, for a book in 1983, it's a bit like you were talking about the Small World book a moment ago, Algie. It's the same idea that a lot of these themes are not entirely new. So it's not strictly about regenerative design, but definitely an interesting book and a highly recommended book about systemic design. And it's totally nerdy. I love it. It's a very nerdy book. So yeah, I strongly encourage you to get hold of a copy. It's also quite beautiful.
Thanks.
That's about it.
No, nice. That's wonderful. I think just sort of building on that, something to look at, and then I welcome Andy is actually Carl Hess, Community Technology. It's really good. It's quite thin, basically, so it's helpful because it's quite distilled. But it's a really interesting process because it was written, in the 80s, and he's really opening up how we approach things, how we enable communities, what community technology is, and kind of defining it and unpacking it. And he's one of, I would say, kind of the founding fathers of kind of like what Fab Labs and things like that could be and how we enable people. And yeah, super cool. He did a really interesting Beyond Liberty. I'll dig it out and put it in the chat, YouTube, many years ago, and it's really good. He's an interesting person. I'm sure he is very conflicted amongst communities, but he's worth looking into. Andy, have you got any thoughts, mate?
Well, in terms of suggested book things, there was one that I'll just put it in the chat. Web of Meaning by Jeremy Lent was one that I read a couple of years ago that I thought was quite good. So it's been a few years, so I probably can't do it justice, but I thought it was so Jeremy Lent, I don't know if anyone's familiar with him already, but he seems like he's like he used to be a bit of a tech guy, Silicon Valley sort of dude. And yeah, kind of left all that behind and started to be a lot more interested in, you could say, slightly more spiritual stuff, definitely like Buddhist sort of thinking and things like that. But he wrote this book, Web of Meaning, which is sort of ties together a lot of disparate ideas, or attempts to tie together some disparate ideas between like science and spirituality and this kind of thing. And so I found that quite useful. It's not explicitly about regeneration. It's actually quite hard to summarize because I think he's just kind of, again, pulling ideas from lots of different places. But I thought he was very good at making some of the themes that he's thinking about sort of accessible to a broader audience. Because I guess this is the other thing with regeneration, is this sort of different sides to it. There is that whole sort of behavior change side of it, as in, if you look at sort of climate crisis and trying to get back to sort of rebalancing a better relationship with nature, then yes, using less carbon is one side of it, and there is a scientific side of it, but there is also that kind of deeper systemic change around actually how we interact with like the wider world and stuff. And so I think he does quite a good job of straddling that. I guess those two camps, sometimes those two camps can be quite different, like quite technocratic over one side and then quite sort of woo-woo over the other side, and he does quite a good job of sort of bridging that divide a little bit. So yeah, that was a good one.
Nice, thank you. John?
So I've just been populating the Miro board as much as I can with things that people have been saying. And indeed finding an online copy of Community Technology by Carl Hess as well. The thing that's emerging from all of these different things so far is maybe it's the betweenness. So I put in my kind of little list there, medium design by Keller Easterling, which isn't directly about regenerative practices, but it is the mode in which you would think about, how do I do this? How do I the work I do is in the in between. It's the sort of like, and it's the relational aspect of saying, well, I can see this here, and I can see this here, and I can see this here, and I can see this here, etc. So how do I infect, hijack, rewire the kind of like the connections between objects rather than work on the design of objects themselves? And that is something I've heard about what Andy's just described, but back to the networks of power that Ian was talking about. And I know quite a lot of all these things is about this kind of like the where is the work? Where is the work that is the phrase that I keep coming back to and going like, okay, where's the work? It's not going to be neatly scribed and specced out of this is the job that you can do and this is the place that you operate and so on. But it's like feeling happy that you are kind of like in that liminal in betweenness and going, okay, so just because there's not a job description about what the thing is to do, just because there's not a one certain invention, you go, I'm not working on one design of things. I'm going, how do you just operate in a way that you can go, new realities, new futures become possible by working in the in between. So that's connecting from sort of things there. So I really like medium design. And then one other, I mean, I've put designing regenerative cultures in there by Daniel Christenwell, which really speaks back to the questions thing that Rob was talking about before as well. Lots of questions that you might not ask those precise questions, but by reading it, you start learning what good questions might be given the context that you're in. Be it sort of like you're doing something in Sussex or in Panama or whatever else and so on, etc. You start learning to go, what is a good question and how can I shape better questions for just to uncover, to reveal, to find things in different ways. So I really like the kind of like the questions that come from that book. And then finally, I've put Robert Macfarlane's Landmarks, which is I think is about context for me because it's like I think it's quite old now as a book, but I remember the sort of like it situates me here in Sussex because I remember reading it and it talks about all of the different languages that different parts of the UK have used for things. So my favourite fact from the book was that Sussex has 50 different words for mud, just because of the kind of like the nature of the sort of like you've got the chalky downs and the clay, and it all comes together and it hangs together in various different ways. So language is a context specific thing, and so therefore you take the context setting from landmarks, you take the questions from designing regenerative cultures, and you take the medium design aspect of working in the in between, and you start to get into a context specific language conscious way of operating that lets you go, okay, so the way that I'm very good at like no, that's not no. I typically come up with names for things and then they go, oh, I'm going to call this a this and whatever else and so on. And I think I'm teaching myself to go, no, we're going to use the words and the names and the labels that people here use, but we might just be playing around with connecting them in different ways so that people can start using their own language to imagine a new reality.
But I think that just picking up on that, I think the terminology is really interesting, and it's part of the reason building on Algie's point about reading. Because I'll be honest, I pick up, put down, then I go, no. Oh, is this for the charity shop? Oh, can I? Oh, man. And I think it's really important. And quite often language has a massive interplay with that. Because you can, it's a really interesting one. You know, it's
Yeah.
the same, it's just the same as talking with a group going, my project, our project. A very simple thing, but it, you know, opens up complexity.
So to jump over to Nathan actually then, before we get into book recommendations, I'm interested in Nathan's perspective, having worked in agriculture and farming environments with new language how that was important or revealed itself to you in that sort of work, Nathan?
It's a really interesting one because I think there's some tribalism is attached to use of language sometimes. And there is, you'll know, you've probably all been in the situation where people start using acronyms, start using certain terms, and it's a necessary shorthand, but it has an effect of sort of potentially alienating people who don't know the shtick. I had to learn very quickly how, first of all, how to sort of do farm management. Then I had to sort of then basically when I cottoned on to the use of the word regenerative, there's and I may have mentioned this last time, but I forget. There's an element of doing regenerative, certainly in the context that I was, which is that it's driven by necessity. There's an element of you do it because you have to. You do it because something's broken. And so when we started picking up using sort of language in the sort of regenerative farming context, it was actually putting names to things that we were doing already. And it was kind of sort of picking up a new sort of vocabulary to offer people as a shorthand to say, when you're talking with somebody, oh yeah, I know all about that. And it's so interesting how I even just asked a question the other day of people about say regenerative food systems and alternative food networks. What would you do? What really, really works? And I tried as a throwaway comment to say something along the lines of, okay, so less livestock is an obvious one. And it's a really interesting thing because immediately somebody who's much more knowledgeable than I am on livestock and landscapes immediately jumped at me and said, hang on a second. So it's sort of every so often it prompts these little sort of tripping up moments where it's like, okay, can we just stop? Are we actually talking about the same thing now? And what is it that I assume when I use that language? Because that's not what I meant. So yeah, I've encountered a fair bit of that, and I think there's an interesting Einstein quote that I learned when I was doing a module on global systems thinking this term, which was make everything as simple as possible, but no simpler, which I thought was quite a good one, and I try and keep that in my head now.
Thanks. I mean, I know it's a different context, but I do quite a lot of work with Stockholm Environmental Institute, and they're partnering on this project. And so many times we're like, no, we mean the same thing, or we mean different things, but we mean that. And I'm very lucky that the colleagues that I work with there are amazing, and they just go, oh, they're really good at onboarding. Oh, do you mean, okay, right, I'm back. And it's a very simple thing. And I think, yeah, it's really interesting while I pick up on books and things from the States, because you go, you don't mean that. You mean something else. And I think it's not just about alignment, but it's also about tone and how we build it and how we learn to listen to these different things and different parties within these different contexts. And I think that's really important. Yeah, and it's huge. And it's like agroforestry is an amazing field that is really starting to build. And yeah, I'm starting to explore it a bit, but it's kind of what it is and how it opens up and what it means for manufacture and processing and development is crazy interesting. And it's one of those things that actually, if we were all able to go, it means this to me. And so, yeah, I mean, another one thing just to build on that, that I would definitely, if you're from Sussex and you've never heard of this man, he's amazing. Michael Blenko, if you ever get the chance. So he does one of the best things. So he recently published this. He used to work for the Sussex Wildlife Trust. I interviewed him for something I'm writing about a week ago, and he does events at the secret campsite that's just near Barkham in East Sussex. They're amazing. And basically he gets people together and he goes, right, these are glowworms. This is this, right? Let's do some moth detection. And I've observed it firsthand that people that have had no interest in the natural world have gone, cool. So how can I do this it's just about experience, about how you enable experience. And I think it's so important. But yeah, he's a really sage voice to look at, and he's incredibly knowledgeable, especially about photographing purple emperor butterflies. If ever that is and I think sometimes it's important in these things to reflect on them. Algie, have you got any other contributions as we keep going round?
Oh, and I want some books from Nathan as well, or at least only because I'm a completist. When I put frames on a kind of, I know Miro board, I want to put things on there.
I can give you a few, and I have to apologize for constantly looking over my shoulder because I came barely having done my homework. There's one that it's backwards. Brad Stulberg's Master of Change. There's a really interesting thing, John, that you said about liminality and some of the times when I've been experiencing some sort of interesting sort of periods of change when it's been a sort of a moment where it's been quite ripe for thinking about new stuff. I read Bridges, the transitions model. I thought that was quite interesting, but this was quite a good one, which was basically about how you change and how you deal with change while everything else is changing. And I found it quite easy to read because I'm also very easily distracted. And then it's going to be backwards again, isn't it? Donella Meadows, Thinking in Systems. This is the course text for Global Systems Thinking this month, and I've gained a hell of a lot from reading it. And the interesting thing that's been happening as I've been reading the Meadows is there's this sort of thing that happens in the back of your head where you kind of feel like things are sort of widening out, and you kind of feel like something sort of a bit spooky is happening. And yeah, it's been really, really interesting to read that. And also I love the quote, something that she said about growth. It's one of the stupidest purposes ever invented by any culture. We've got to have an enough. Always ask, growth of what and why and for whom and who pays the cost and how long can it last and what's the cost to the planet and how much is enough. And then I've got a third book which I would say Andy's already got it. It's At Work in the Ruins by Dougal Hine. And if you've not read it, basically I've ordered it and I have to read it because I listened to an interview with Dougal Hine on the Farmgate podcast, and I was sent it by a friend of mine who is interested, who has a regenerative coaching practice, and who is interested in really sort of developing what he's doing. And he and I were both sort of saying how we just kept having light bulb moments going off. So I can share a link to the Farmgate podcast episode in the chat, but I thought the conversation was absolutely incredible, and I need to go and read that book now. So I'm sort of cheating because I haven't read it yet.
Thank you. That's wonderful. I think that the whole point of this platform is to just go, this is really exciting. This is interesting. How can we take it? It's a bit like Chris Major's small scale farming is lovely. And it's really interesting. Yeah. He's good, man. He's really good. And I think quite often it's really nice, Nathan, to hear those ties, because agriculture, I think, is so often alienated as people see it as good and bad practices. The same as sustainable practices. It's not. It's so much harder than that. And I don't think people really understand what it takes to feed a nation from, without massive import. It's a really interesting field.
Good. Nathan,
Yeah.
can I ask you something? I don't know what type of farming you were kind of specializing in. So a chap I know who used to be half of Groove Armada, a guy called Andy Cato, set up this thing called Wild Farmed.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts about that? Are you familiar with it, first of all?
Yeah, so it's essentially a sort of a low impact pasture cropping system for wheat, but what it's got wrapped around it is some really, really good marketing.
Right.
And so I'm actually sort of there are various different ways to approach this, and one of the biggest issues with embedding regenerative practices and with systemic change is scaling. And the interesting thing is that what he's in all likelihood demonstrating with Wild Fund is that by sort of building a good commercial model for it and sort of selling it out through Marks and Spencers and really packaging that up well, that's potentially an example of something that can deal with that scaling problem. And so yeah, I mean he's fantastic. He actually sold the rights to his music so he could buy his farm.
Yes, yes. Well, so what I really, oh sorry.
Yeah, no, go on.
Well, what I really liked about it was one of the things that gives me one of the things I find really depressing is that we talk about all the things that we're doing and we talk about all the ways and the interventions, and somebody posted the Donella Meadows leverage points, and I always get, because I've done quite a lot of work in the field of kind of startup techs and all these kind of things, and and the sort of power that venture capital investors have in that world have shaped the entire way that technology emerges and becomes popular in the world that we see, to enormous damage. I mean, I think venture capital is possibly one of the most damaging institutions that we've had over the last 50 years. But it does recognize the fact that ultimately we either completely destroy capitalism and kind of go back to an Ivan Ilyich, pre-growth sort of world, or we need to find ways of navigating a path that kind of makes it so the things that we're doing financially viable. And I really liked the whole Wild Farmed approach on that by looking at it from reverse and saying, how can I create a market for the products that these people will buy such that they will pay a little bit more for their output and therefore make it a viable business decision for them to embrace regenerative practice. I don't know, is everybody familiar with the model? I don't know if you are, but essentially it's a no-till, low impact, mainly wheat, like you said. And the idea was that he wanted to make sure that if you learned how to do this approach, you would be able to sell your wheat at a slightly higher margin and therefore ensure your financial stability. And so he approached Ocado and Marks and Spencers and people like that and said, look, there are products for which the actual ingredient price, for example, in a pizza, the ingredient price of the wheat is really low compared to the actual price of the product. And therefore it doesn't make a huge impact on the final retail price, but it does make an impact on the money that the farmer will get. Does that summarize it well, Nathan? I think you know more about it.
Yeah, I think so. There are broader issues with, Sustain did a study recently that showed that a standard farmer growing wheat is making fractions of a penny in profit on a loaf of bread because there's so much sort of margin stacking going on. So there's the sort of the considerations around what systemically is different to allow, for example, to incentivize food producers to adopt practices that in the case of Wild Farmed will actually involve them investing in some new machinery and other bits and pieces. But yeah, I mean the ability to sort of make something like that work commercially, it is one of various different sort of models and ways of doing it. And it's a really interesting thing. You've sort of reminded me of this idea of having to smash everything to sort of start something else. There was a Buckminster Fuller quote, which was along the lines of, if you want to embed a new if you want to systemic change, you have to make a new system that's so good enough it sort of makes the old system redundant. And the interesting thing about that is that, is if we're, if we're honest, I don't know how likely is that likely to be anytime soon. Sue Pritchard, who's heads up the Food Farming Countryside Commission, who is looking at essentially trying to promote agroecological food systems transformation in the UK, would essentially say, I asked her a question about it not so long ago, along the lines of, we've got 16 different government departments who are making food policy in England and Wales. The mechanism of government isn't going to sort of change anytime soon. So we have to sort of engage with people where we find them. And I suppose, Rob, there's a language point about that. But there's a really interesting story, which is one way of articulating all this, is that there's a story of separation, something that Charles Eisenstein described, which ties into our food farming systems, our treatment of the environment. And he would say, I think he said in one of his books that we are in a ripe situation where we have a sort of the beginning of a wonderful new story of interbeing. And it all sounds very exciting, but we've kind of got this really messy, non-stop messiness that between here and between this point and that point, as John's put it, there's this liminal bit that quite possibly doesn't stop being liminal for God knows how long. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking.
I think Nathan, this is a good point. But to me, it's like the amount of energy that's getting invested into sustaining the current system versus investing into designing or redesigning an alternative. Like, I'm not suggesting it's not out there, but it's disproportionate, and that's what I think part of that problem is, especially with government. Although, yeah, it just sort of feels like everyone knows it's broken, but they just want to try to keep putting sticking plasters on it to keep fixing it. It's not like the current government are stopping talking about growth, for instance, even, like all of those sort of embedded systemic defaults that people don't even question, that you have to have the growth thing. It's sort of, yeah, that's the disappointing thing for me personally. I think maybe that's why, just rounding that back to the Dougal Hine book, that was definitely my favorite book of the year, by the way. I read it near the start of the year, I think, or maybe it was last year actually. But I think there was something refreshing about it, because although it could be read by some people as sort of negative, I think there's a certain, he arrives at the situation with a sort of a realism about what situation we're actually in, rather than a sort of denialism about how bad things really can get. And so he's sort of saying a good starting point psychologically is to accept the fact that some things are lost and cannot be sort of regained or sustained, and like work from there. But I think he does it in a way that, for me personally anyway, it wasn't like overtly negative, but I think it could be read by some people as like, oh wow, this is a bit too gloomy for me. I need something that's a bit more like, techno optimism. Just give me some technology solutions. I think he's a bit more, but it's an interesting book. It's definitely worth a read, I would say.
But AI will solve it, Andy. AI will solve everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a similar. I haven't read the Hines one, but I read a very short book the other day called "Learning to Die in the Anthropocene," which I thought was it's quite a few years old now, but I think it's almost like a Good Onion article. You only really need to read the headline, but it's essentially, the idea is that it was written by a former US soldier who went to Iraq, and he said one of the things that helps you cope in those situations is accepting that you may well die today, and the point he's trying to make is it's already gone. We've in a way the damage is baked in so deeply that now it should be about how we cope with living amongst the ruins and doing something new, rather than trying to put the brakes on. And it is. It's quite a moving book, but it's about that. It's about accepting that we're kind of fucked, and maybe that's, I don't know. I have no end of that thought. Sorry.
That really, one of the things that keeps me going and thinking, oh, I'm a craftsperson trying to do good in the world, is the idea of looking back from my deathbed and being like, could I tell my children that I really tried and I'm proud of what I did? But yeah, I think that's you've just given me a very valid reason to not necessarily aim for that that perspective. But yeah, it's kind of, all of this is in terms of the language thing as well, and the Doubly article that I shared. A big point of that is that, like, design thinking and the linearization of the way that let's just say any knowledge domain discipline in the knowledge economy, I feel it's easy to say you solve particular problems. That's the obvious thing to say. It's convincing. That's what people want. They want their problems to be solved. It's not true that it works. So it's basically this rampant charlatanism in the knowledge economy, or people convinced that their linear methods that they've scaled and then apply kind of as a almost product to solving problems within that domain. And they teach the language, and they teach the tools to the to individuals within those particular environments. So then it becomes a self-fulfilling thing where people might be on their own, a person with principle, a person with decent values, and yet the way that the system is this kind of well, you have to convince people to buy your product. You have to scale the way that your product works for efficiency's sake. You have to teach people to kind of be automated kind of agents in these delivering on the product that you've promised people by virtue of the process that you've described in order to sell it. And yeah, it's just, for me, it's such a challenge to think, well, how do you package something that is saying, this is a messy, entangled thing that won't really be fixed. This is just something that we can continuously reappraise and try and make a little bit better. But how do you compete in a system where they have scaled charlatanism or self-beguilement? But yeah, it's an interesting challenge, and one that I'm desperately seeking possible answers for. But yeah, the convincing at scale is a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, my summary of that is, do we need to, and how does that work in those spaces? And that's what I was in a privileged position to have a conversation with Professor Ron Wackery last night, and I don't think things always have to scale. I never have, and I think that's something that's quite interesting. Maybe they repeat, maybe there's local agency, but I don't think, like, I think it is okay to go, this is going to work here, and that's all right. And it's like, there is the best toilet that I've ever seen in my life in Nepal that works very well, that runs a cafe next door to it off a biodigester, and the coffee that they sell then pays for the maintenance of the toilet. It's amazing, and it works there. It would be brilliant if it worked other places, but it works there, and that's okay. And I think that's the hardest thing, is kind of, how do we accept new paradigms? And we're nearly at wrapping up time. Nathan, you had a point that you wanted to.
Two very succinct things. One of which is that Donella Meadows, when she's talking about systems, she talks about the capacity of systems to surprise us, and that the dynamics that are there in place include things like social contagion, which, you know, who knows what the conditions are for something to sort of take off. So something only does need to work in one area, and then, you know, maybe it does. There's another thing which is about this, whether you accept that we're doomed or whether you are sort of optimistic. The quotation is something along the lines of, you know, sort of a mark of intelligence is about being able to sort of simultaneously hold two opinions. And yeah, there was a nice thing I saw the other day, which was I think it was Our World in Data, who were they shared something on Blue Sky, and they said everything is awful, everything is better, everything can be better, and all three of those things can be true.
Can I throw in one comment from what you said, Rob, about the scaling thing? Is, I think there is some stuff in the literature about the idea that scaling doesn't, you know, you can scale across, you can scale deep, you can scale in different ways. It doesn't just mean this one thing has to be infinitely replicated. It can be copied and changed, or it can be more profoundly scaled into the system in which it operates. I can't find the paper that I read about that, but I liked that idea, especially because coming from the kind of tech startup world, this idea of scalability is one of the most depressing things I find, because almost inevitably what that means is enshittification. And I find, it's very hard to scale caring. It's very hard to scale sort of any empathic, humanistic approach, I find. You can't, loving at scale is quite a hard thing to do.
Agreed. Well, thank you all so much. I think I am going to stop the recording there. And I would like to thank you for really inspiring links and chats and kind of links to books. I don't know if, John, if there's anything else you wanted to add in summary.
Not only that, I will share the Miro board and make it open for, I think, the whole Steps Collective, but then also encourage people to leave other things on there in similar way. And then at the very least, people can find a book for the Christmas list. Because everyone always asks, "What do you want for Christmas?" And you go, I have socks. Maybe one of these.
Absolutely.